A dirty old farm woman doesn't belong in a luxury building. Those were the words that kept echoing in my head while I stood alone in the freezing Chicago wind with 2 suitcases at my feet and nowhere to go. 3 days earlier, I had still been in Iowa, standing on the porch of the farmhouse my husband built with his own hands back in 1974. The same white wooden porch where my son Daniel used to chase fireflies during summer nights. The same land where I buried my husband Walter after cancer took him 12 years ago. I never thought I would leave that farm alive. But loneliness does strange things to people after 65. Especially when your only child keeps calling and saying things like, "Mom, you shouldn't be alone anymore," or "Ellie misses you," or "Your family. You belong with us now." So I believed him. God help me, I believed every word. I sold nearly 80 acres of land outside Cedar Rapids for less than it was worth because Daniel said the market was changing and I shouldn't wait too long. I sold Walter's tractor. I sold the horses. I even sold the old oak dining table that had been in our family for 3 generations because Vanessa said their condo didn't have room for country furniture. That sentence should have warned me. But when you're a mother, you spend your whole life turning warnings into excuses for your children. The morning I left Iowa, snow covered the fields like a white blanket stretching for miles. I remember locking the farmhouse door for the last time with trembling fingers while my breath turned to fog in the cold December air. My pickup truck was packed with only what mattered: clothes, family photo albums, Walter's Army medals, and 1 small box of Ellie's birthday gifts. I stood there for almost 10 minutes staring at the barn. I could still hear Walter laughing somewhere in my memories. "You sure about this, Maggie?" he used to say whenever I made impulsive decisions. Back then I always had him beside me. This time I answered the silence alone. I just want to be near my family. The drive to Chicago took almost 5 hours. Every mile farther from Iowa felt heavier in my chest. Cornfields slowly disappeared behind. Highways and gray buildings. By the time I reached downtown Chicago, the sky looked dark and crowded, just like the city itself. Daniel had texted me the condo address but said he was stuck in a meeting, so Vanessa would meet me downstairs. I remember feeling nervous as I parked beside the towering glass building. Men in expensive coats walked past me without making eye contact. Women carried tiny designer dogs wearing little sweaters that probably cost more than my winter boots. I suddenly became painfully aware of the mud stains still stuck in the grooves of my old leather boots. Iowa has a way of staying on you no matter how hard you scrub. I grabbed my suitcases and stepped into the marble lobby. That was the moment my old life ended. The lobby smelled like expensive perfume and polished marble. Nothing like the clean scent of soil and pinewood I had known my entire life. I stood there awkwardly beside my suitcases while people rushed past me without looking up from their phones. Somewhere above me, soft piano music played through hidden speakers, and for the first time since leaving Iowa, I felt completely out of place. Then I saw her walking toward me in tall beige heels that clicked sharply against the floor. Vanessa Whitmore always looked like she belonged on the cover of one of those magazines in grocery store checkout lines. Perfect blonde hair. Cream-colored coat that probably cost more than my old pickup truck. Gold jewelry that sparkled every time she moved her hand. She smiled when she reached me, but it was the kind of smile people use on strangers they do not plan to see again. "Margaret," she said quickly before giving me a stiff one-armed hug. "Long drive." "About 5 hours," I answered softly. Traffic got pretty heavy outside Joliet. Her eyes moved down to my boots before I even finished speaking. I suddenly wished I had bought new ones before coming to Chicago. There were still traces of dried mud around the soles from loading boxes into the truck back at the farm. Vanessa noticed immediately. She stepped back slightly. Not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me to feel it. Then the elevator doors opened behind her, and a little voice squealed, "Grandma!" Ellie came running out wearing a pink winter coat and tiny snow boots with white fur around the top. The moment I saw her, my heart nearly burst. She had grown so much since the last Christmas I spent with them. I dropped to one knee and opened my arms. "Look at you, sweetheart," I whispered with tears filling my eyes. But just before Ellie reached me, Vanessa gently grabbed her shoulder and stopped her. "Careful, baby," she said with a little laugh. "Do not touch Grandma's coat yet." Ellie blinked in confusion. "Why?" Vanessa looked directly at me when she answered. "Because it smells like a barn." My chest tightened instantly, For 1 second, nobody spoke. Even the elevator seemed quieter somehow. Ellie looked embarrassed without understanding why. I forced a smile onto my face because children always notice everything adults try to hide. Farms do have smells, I said softly. That is part of life. Vanessa pressed the elevator button again. Well, we are not really used to that here. The doors opened and she turned toward Ellie. Come on, sweetheart. We do not want someone filthy living around us. The word filthy hit harder than I expected. I had spent 40 years waking before sunrise, feeding animals in freezing winters, tending crops during storms, washing dirt from my hands before every family dinner. That farm paid for Daniel's college tuition. That farm bought the suit he wore at his wedding. That farm helped cover the down payment for the luxury condo we were now standing inside. But suddenly, in Vanessa's world, dirt meant shame instead of sacrifice. I stayed silent and followed them into the elevator. My reflection in the mirrored wall looked older than I remembered. Tired gray hair tucked beneath my wool hat. Wrinkled hands gripping worn suitcase handles. A woman who had traded everything familiar for the hope of feeling wanted again. As the elevator climbed higher and higher above the city, I began to realize something painful. I had not been invited there because they loved me. I had been invited there because they thought they could change me. The condo sat on the 32nd floor overlooking downtown Chicago, but despite the expensive view, it never felt warm to me. Everything inside looked untouched, like one of those model apartments real estate agents show to strangers. White walls, white furniture, white rugs that made me nervous to step on. Vanessa gave me a quick tour while Ellie skipped ahead, happily holding my hand whenever her mother was not looking. The kitchen is here, Vanessa said flatly. Please use the gray dishes only. The white imported plates are for guests. Then she pointed toward a narrow hallway near the laundry room. And this will be your space. I stopped walking when she opened the door. It was not a bedroom. It was barely larger than the storage shed behind my old barn. A twin bed had been squeezed between stacked moving boxes and metal shelves filled with Christmas decorations. There was no window. Just a tiny lamp beside the bed and a folded blanket placed neatly at the corner like someone preparing a room for a temporary guest. Daniel said you would make it more cozy once you settled in, Vanessa said casually. I forced another smile. This is fine. She nodded quickly, clearly relieved I was not complaining. Oh, and one more thing. We try to keep a very structured household here. Then she handed me a laminated sheet of paper. First, I honestly thought it was a joke. Across the top in elegant gold letters it read, House Guidelines. Underneath were rules listed one by one. No television volume above level 15 after 8 o'clock. No cooking with strong odors. No muddy shoes beyond entry area. No guests without notice. Laundry only on Tuesdays and Fridays. Avoid discussing upsetting topics around Ellie. I stared at the paper in disbelief while Vanessa continued speaking as if this were completely normal. Ellie thrives on consistency, she explained. And Daniel works very hard, so we maintain a peaceful environment. I looked down at the final rule near the bottom. Please avoid bringing rural habits into shared living spaces. My fingers tightened around the paper. Rural habits. As though kindness, hard work, and family dinners were diseases people caught from farms. Before I could answer, the front door suddenly opened. Daniel walked inside carrying his laptop bag and talking into a wireless earpiece. Yes, move the presentation to Thursday, he said before finally noticing me standing there. Mom. His face lit up for half a second before exhaustion took over again. He hugged me quickly with one arm while still holding his phone. You made it okay? I did, I answered quietly. The drive was not too bad. Good. He looked toward Vanessa. Everything settled? Vanessa smiled perfectly. We were just going over house expectations. Daniel nodded immediately without even asking what that meant. Perfect. Then he disappeared into his office and shut the door. That was it. No long conversation. No asking how I felt after leaving the only home I had ever known. No noticing the tiny room they had placed me in. I stood there listening to the muffled sound of his business call through the office wall, while Ellie wandered into my little room holding a stuffed rabbit. Grandma, she whispered softly, do you like horses better than Chicago? I looked into her bright blue eyes and almost laughed from the sadness sitting in my chest. Horses are easier to understand, I told her gently. Ellie smiled. But out in the hallway, I caught Vanessa watching us with an expression so cold it made the room feel even smaller. The evening arrived quietly in the condo, but the silence inside felt heavier than any noise I had known on the farm. Vanessa had told me earlier that Daniel would be hosting a small dinner with important colleagues, and that I should keep things simple and observe more than speak. I did not fully understand what she meant until I stepped into the dining area. A long glass table stretched across the room, perfectly set with silver cutlery aligned with mathematical precision, crystal glasses reflecting the soft golden light from the chandelier above. Everything looked staged like a photograph rather than a place where people actually lived. I stood near the hallway entrance holding my hands together, unsure where I was supposed to sit. Vanessa approached immediately and gently guided me toward the far end of the table, the seat closest to the kitchen. "This is easier for everyone," she said with a polite smile that did not reach her eyes. I nodded quietly and sat down. Within minutes, guests began to arrive. Men in tailored suits. Women wearing dresses that looked too delicate to touch. They greeted Daniel warmly and shook Vanessa's hand as if she were hosting a business event rather than a family dinner. No one asked who I was at first, which made it easier to remain invisible. That illusion lasted only until Vanessa began introductions. "This is Daniel's mother," she said smoothly, as if announcing a distant relative rather than someone who had raised him. "She is originally from a small farming community in Iowa." A man across the table smiled politely. "That must be quite a change coming to the city." Before I could respond, Vanessa laughed lightly. "Oh, she is adjusting. Although we are still helping her understand modern living standards." The words landed softly but carried an unmistakable weight. I lowered my eyes to my plate, feeling the warmth leave my face. Daniel was seated halfway down the table, engaged in conversation about a corporate project. He glanced at me once but quickly returned to his discussion. Ellie was not present, which made the room feel even colder. As dinner progressed, I noticed subtle things I was not meant to notice. Vanessa corrected how I held my fork when I reached for bread. She gently moved my water glass farther away when she thought I might accidentally spill. She laughed at small jokes made about rural life, never directly insulting me but never defending me either. I ate slowly, careful not to draw attention, while conversations around me moved faster and louder. At one point, a guest asked about investment opportunities in farmland. Vanessa immediately responded, "We actually sold most of that. It was time to move on from outdated assets." I froze slightly at the phrase outdated assets. She was talking about my life as if it were something obsolete, something to be discarded and forgotten. Daniel still did not speak. After dessert, the conversation shifted toward education and upbringing. A woman asked Vanessa how she manages work-life balance with a child. Vanessa smiled and said, "We make sure Ellie is raised in a very structured and refined environment. No confusion, no unnecessary influences." I felt my fingers tighten slightly under the table. When the guests finally began to leave, I quietly stood to help clear dishes, but Vanessa stopped me with a soft hand on my arm. "Please relax," she said gently. "You have already done enough tonight just by being here." The way she said it sounded kind on the surface, but underneath it carried the message that my presence itself was an inconvenience. Later that night, after everyone had gone, I stood alone in the small hallway outside my room, listening to the distant sound of the city outside the windows. Daniel passed by without noticing me, still on his phone, still working. Vanessa was already upstairs, and Ellie's laughter from earlier that afternoon felt like it belonged to another world entirely. I realized then that I was not part of their life here. I was something placed carefully at the edge of it, visible but never included, present but never truly wanted. The days inside the condo began to blur together, each one following the same quiet pattern that made time feel heavier instead of shorter. Morning light would slip through the tall city windows, reflecting off the polished surfaces, while I would wake up in the small windowless room Vanessa had assigned me. The first sound I usually heard was Daniel already on calls in his office, speaking in fast, serious tones about deadlines and meetings. The second sound was Vanessa moving through the kitchen with controlled precision, her footsteps soft but purposeful, as if even her walking had a schedule. Ellie was the only reason the apartment ever felt alive. She would run into my small space every morning before breakfast, still half asleep, carrying her stuffed rabbit and asking me simple questions about the farm, about animals, about whether horses ever got lonely. I always answered her honestly, even when the answers made her giggle or tilt her head in confusion. One morning while helping her put on her shoes, she asked, "Grandma, why do you stay in the small room?" I paused for a moment trying to find words that would not sound like sadness. "Sometimes people adjust so others can be comfortable," I said softly. Ellie frowned. "But you are family too." Before I could answer, Vanessa appeared at the doorway. She had that same composed expression she always wore, the one that looked like a smile from a distance but felt like a boundary up close. "Ellie, you need to get ready for school," she said gently. Then her eyes briefly shifted toward me. "And Margaret, please remember we have a very structured morning routine." I nodded as I always did. That was becoming my role in this home. Not a voice, not a presence, just quiet agreement. Later that day, while Vanessa was on a video call in the living room, I quietly walked to the kitchen to pour myself a glass of water. I moved carefully, trying not to disturb anything. The kitchen was spotless, almost unused despite its luxury appliances. As I reached for a glass, I accidentally placed it on the wrong side of the counter. It was a small mistake, something that would not have mattered in any normal home. But Vanessa noticed immediately. She ended her call abruptly and walked over. "We usually keep things organized a certain way," she said softly, taking the glass and repositioning it exactly 2 inches to the left. Her tone was calm, almost polite, but there was no warmth behind it. "It helps maintain balance in the household." "I understand," I replied quietly. That was what I always said. Understand. Adjust. Accept. Daniel walked through the kitchen a moment later, still speaking into his phone, barely acknowledging the tension in the room. He kissed Ellie on the forehead, grabbed a coffee, and left again without looking at either of us. It struck me how easily he moved through this life, like he belonged completely to it, while I stood at the edges like something temporary. That afternoon, Ellie came back from school excited, holding a drawing she had made. It showed a large house, a small barn, and 3 stick figures standing together under a bright sun. "That is you, me, and Grandma," she said proudly. Vanessa glanced at it briefly and smiled in a controlled way. "That is very creative, sweetheart," she said, then gently guided Ellie toward homework. But I noticed she placed the drawing face down on the table afterward. Later that evening, I sat alone in the small room listening to the distant sounds of the city outside the windowless walls. I thought about the farm in Iowa, about how silence there had never felt empty the way it did here. Out there, silence meant peace, space, belonging. Here, silence meant absence. And for the first time since arriving, I began to understand something I had not been ready to accept. I was not being slowly included into their life. I was being slowly edited out of it. I did not hear the words that changed everything. It was not a loud argument, not a dramatic confrontation, not anything that would have made sense in a moment you could prepare for. It happened on a quiet morning that looked exactly like every other morning inside the condo. Ellie had already left for school, Daniel had rushed out early for a meeting, and Vanessa was upstairs on a video call speaking in her calm professional voice. I was in my small room folding the same clothes I had already folded twice that week, simply because there was nothing else to do, when I heard voices coming from the hallway outside my door. Vanessa's tone was different this time. Still controlled but sharper underneath, like something carefully pressed down was starting to rise. I stopped moving and listened without meaning to. "It is not sustainable," she said quietly. There was a pause, then Daniel's voice, lower and tired. "She is my mother, Vanessa." "I understand that," Vanessa replied immediately, too quickly. "But understanding does not change the situation. This is not what we discussed. We agreed it would be temporary." Temporary. That word stayed in the air longer than anything else. I slowly set the folded shirt down on the bed and moved closer to the door without opening it. I did not want to intrude, but something inside me already knew I was hearing something I was never meant to hear. Vanessa continued speaking, her tone soft again, almost careful. "She is adjusting poorly. The space is small. The habits are difficult for Ellie. You can see it. She is confused." Daniel sighed. "What?" Are you suggesting? A longer pause followed. I could hear footsteps shifting, like Vanessa was choosing her words with precision. There are excellent assisted living communities just outside the city, she said. Very clean. Structured. She would have support. And we could focus on Ellie without distractions. The word distractions felt like a cold draft through the wall. I pressed my hand lightly against the doorframe, not because I was weak, but because my legs suddenly felt unfamiliar. Daniel did not answer right away. That silence hurt more than anything else. She gave up everything to come here, he finally said, but his voice did not carry strength. It carried exhaustion. Vanessa softened again instantly. And we are grateful. But gratitude does not mean sacrificing stability. I stepped back from the door and sat slowly on the edge of the bed. My hands were shaking slightly, though I tried to stop it. Outside, the city moved like nothing important was happening at all. Cars passed far below. People walked into buildings. Lives continued without interruption. Inside this room, something in mine was quietly being decided without me. I thought about the farm again. About cold mornings when the wind cut across open fields. About how every corner of that land had felt like it belonged to me. Not because it was perfect, but because it had history, struggle, and truth inside it. I thought about Walter. About Daniel as a child running barefoot through the grass. And I realized something I had refused to see clearly until now. I had not left my home to become part of theirs. I had left my home to become someone they could eventually move elsewhere. The conversation in the condo changed after that morning, even though nothing outside seemed different. Vanessa was still perfectly polite in public, Daniel was still rushing between meetings, and Ellie still filled the small spaces of the apartment with her innocent questions. But I could feel something underneath all of it now, like a door slowly closing that no one was willing to acknowledge out loud. Vanessa became more attentive in a way that was not kindness but calculation. She started asking Daniel questions. In front of me, questions that sounded reasonable on the surface but always pointed in one direction. Do you think she is comfortable here? She asked during breakfast one morning while pouring orange juice. Do you think she understands city living? Daniel hesitated every time, and that hesitation told me more than his words ever did. Ellie remained my only true connection in that house. She would come to me after school and sit beside me while I quietly helped her with simple things, like reading assignments or tying her shoes. One afternoon, she asked me if I was happy in Chicago. I looked at her for a long moment before answering. Happiness is not always a place, I said gently. Sometimes it is just a moment with someone you love. She smiled, but I noticed Vanessa watching from the kitchen doorway without saying anything. A few days later, I found a folder left on the dining table when no one was home. It was not hidden, but it was also not meant for me to see. Inside were printed documents with headings like senior care options, residential living plans, and transition support programs. My name was already written in more than one place. At the bottom of one page, there was a note in Vanessa's handwriting discussing timing and minimal disruption to Daniel's schedule. I sat there for a long time without moving, simply holding the papers. It was not anger that came first. It was recognition. The kind that arrives slowly after you have ignored too many small signals. That evening, I quietly placed the folder exactly where I had found it. I did not mention it to anyone. Not because I was afraid, but because I needed to understand how far this had already gone. Over the next few days, I began noticing patterns I had previously overlooked. Vanessa would leave the room whenever I entered conversations with Daniel. Phone calls would suddenly stop when I came near. Discussions about future plans would change tone the moment I sat down. It was not loud rejection. It was organized distance. One morning, while Ellie was at school and Daniel had already left, I stood near the large window in the living room looking down at the city streets below. People were moving with purpose, going somewhere that felt certain. I thought about my life before this apartment, about soil under my fingernails, about seasons that changed with honesty instead of negotiation. I realized then that what I had been experiencing was not confusion or misunderstanding. It was preparation. I was being quietly guided toward a version of my life that no longer included this family in any meaningful way. And the most painful part was not the plan itself. It was how gently it was being carried out, as if erasing someone could ever be made soft enough to feel acceptable. I did not need anyone to tell me that something was about to happen. because the atmosphere inside the condo had already changed in a way that made every moment feel like it was leaning toward an ending I had not agreed to. That morning began like the others, quiet and carefully arranged, with Ellie already at school and Daniel already gone, leaving only the distant sound of Vanessa moving through the apartment like someone preparing a final presentation rather than a home. I was in the kitchen washing a single glass when I heard her heels approaching from behind me. She did not speak at first, and that silence alone was enough to make me pause. When I turned, she was standing there holding a neatly printed folder, her expression calm in the way that always meant something important was about to be said without emotion. "We need to talk," she said softly. I dried my hands slowly and nodded, already feeling what was coming before she even opened the folder. She placed it on the counter between us, perfectly aligned, as if even this conversation needed to look organized. "Daniel and I have been discussing options," she continued, her voice steady and polite. "We think it would be best for everyone if we helped you transition into a more suitable living arrangement." The words were carefully chosen, but their meaning was not. I looked down at the folder without touching it. I already knew what was inside. "There are some very good places nearby," she added quickly, almost rehearsed. "They specialize in care, structure, and social engagement. You would not be alone, and it would actually be better for your well-being." I slowly pulled the folder toward me and opened it. Inside were brochures, printed photographs, and documents with my name already typed into forms I had never seen before. Everything was prepared. Everything was decided. I did not feel surprise. I felt confirmation. "Does Daniel know you are doing this now?" I asked quietly. Vanessa nodded immediately. "Of course." We both agreed this is the most responsible decision. The way she said it made it sound reasonable, even kind, as if removing me from their life was an act of care rather than convenience. I closed the folder gently and placed my hand on top of it. For a long moment I said nothing. I thought about the farm again, about how decisions there were never made in silence or behind closed doors. Everything had been spoken, shared, lived together. Even hardship had been honest. When would this happen? I finally asked. Vanessa exhaled softly, relieved that I was not resisting. "Soon," she said. "We were thinking within the next few weeks, after Ellie adjusts to her new school schedule." That was the first time I felt something sharp rise in my chest, not anger exactly but clarity. I was not being asked to leave. I was being scheduled. "I see," I said quietly. My voice did not shake, and that seemed to surprise her slightly. She softened her tone again, as if trying to reassure me. "You will be much more comfortable. It is just a better fit for your stage of life." A better fit, like furniture being moved to another room. I nodded once, slowly, as if accepting what she needed me to accept in that moment. "I understand," I repeated, the same words I had used so many times before in that house. Vanessa smiled faintly, believing the conversation was complete. She picked up the folder and stepped back, already turning her attention toward whatever came next in her day. But I stayed standing in the kitchen long after she left the room, looking at the empty space where the decision had just been made about my life. Outside, the city moved forward as always, indifferent and fast. Inside, I finally understood that the quiet I had been living in was never peace. It was preparation. That morning arrived with a strange kind of stillness, the kind that does not feel peaceful, but instead feels like something has already been decided, without you being present. I woke up earlier than usual and sat for a long time in the small room, listening to the distant sounds of the city moving beyond the walls. There was no rush inside the apartment, no visible urgency, but I could feel it anyway, like invisible hands quietly rearranging the shape of my life. Ellie came to my door before breakfast, holding her school bag and smiling as if nothing had changed. "Grandma, will you read to me tonight?" she asked softly. I looked at her for a moment, wanting to hold on to the simplicity in her voice. "Of course," I said gently. "If you still want me to." She nodded happily and ran off, unaware that anything heavier than a normal morning was unfolding around her. A few hours later, Vanessa entered my room without knocking. She was dressed neatly as always, her expression controlled but different today, less performative, more final. She placed a thin folder on the small desk near my bed. "Everything is arranged," she said calmly. "We found a place that can take you within the week." I did not open the folder. I already understood what it contained. Daniel agreed? I asked quietly. She hesitated just long enough for the truth to show itself before she answered. He understands it is the best option. Understands. Not chose. Not decided. Just accepted. I stood up slowly, walking to the small windowless corner of the room that I had come to know too well. I sold everything I had to come here, I said softly, more to myself than to her. My home, my land, my entire life. Vanessa's tone softened slightly, as if trying to preserve politeness. And we are grateful for that. But this is different now. You need support we cannot provide here. I turned back toward her. Support, I repeated. The word felt unfamiliar in her voice. Before she could respond further, Daniel appeared in the doorway behind her. He looked tired, carrying the weight of work and decisions he had not fully spoken aloud. For a brief moment our eyes met and I saw something there that I had seen before in people who were about to avoid saying something painful. Mom, he said quietly. That was all he said at first. Vanessa stepped aside, letting him speak, but still present like a shadow behind his words. It is just temporary, he continued. We will make sure you are comfortable. I nodded slowly, not because I agreed but because I had learned that disagreement no longer changed anything. Ellie's voice echoed faintly from the hallway, laughing about something on her way to school, completely unaware that decisions about my future were being finalized just a few steps away. After Daniel left, Vanessa lingered for a moment longer. We are doing this because we care, she said gently, almost rehearsed. I looked at her for a long moment. There was no anger left in me at that point, only clarity. Care, I repeated quietly. She did not respond. That evening, I packed my belongings into 2 suitcases. There was not much left anymore. Most of what had defined my life was already far away in Iowa, in fields and barns and memories that no longer fit inside this place. Ellie came into my room while I was folding the last sweater. She sat beside me without speaking for a while, then leaned her head against my arm. Grandma, she whispered. Are you leaving because of me? I stopped moving immediately. No, I said gently, touching her hair. Never because of you. She stayed like that for a moment longer, then quietly said, I wish you could stay forever. I closed my eyes for a brief second, holding back everything I could not say. I will always be with you, I told her softly. Later that night, after the apartment had gone quiet, I stood alone near the windowless wall of the room one last time. I thought about how quietly endings can arrive when no one is willing to call them by their name. And I understood then that I was not being sent away suddenly. I had been slowly removed from their life long before anyone ever said the words out loud.